Kia ora, I'm Emile Donovan.
It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Government funding for the annual secondary school Shakespeare Festival Sheilah Winn is not to be, with Creative New Zealand cutting its funding after 10 years.
The reaction has been swift and brutal, particularly on social media. Shakespeare has been cancelled, some have said. Others said this will be laid at the feet of the government. Others said, we get to have F-Boy Island, but not Shakespeare.
Shakespeare talks about human nature. It's not something it dates.
It was a distinctly un-Shakespearean drama. But all's well that ends well.
The Ministry of Education intends to reach out to the Shakespeare Globe Centre to work with them to find a solution that ensures that the program will continue to be offered.
Nonetheless, this whole saga did throw up some interesting ideas. From the role of Shakespeare in 2022 to what decolonising art actually means, to how our artists and writers and playwrights are funded, and who gets what. So today on The Detail, Massey University senior lecturer and Shakespeare expert Dr. Hannah August on this most unfortunate comedy of errors. Now, there's a lot of what you might generously call misreporting of what actually went on in this story. So I began by asking Hannah August to outline the facts for us.
As I understand it, there has recently been a major Creative New Zealand funding round. Creative New Zealand is a body that is separate from the government, is given funding that it then allocates in a number of different contestable funding rounds to arts organisations and individual artists around Aotearoa. Some of the pots in the rounds are bigger than others, and one of the big rounds, results of that have just been announced, and one of the things that was announced was that the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand, which is an organisation that's been around for several decades and has been running throughout that time the Sheilah Winn Shakespeare Festival, which I was involved with as a teen, perhaps you were as well. I think they say that 140,000 rangatahi have been involved with it since its inception. So it's a big deal. It's something that many high school kids in New Zealand would be involved with. They run that. They have a relatively large operating budget to run that, and they applied for funding equivalent to about 1/10 of that operating budget, I think about $30,000, and they had received this money from the Kahikatea funding pot in the past, but this year their funding application was declined. And then suddenly things kind of went crazy because this got picked up in the media as the cancellation of the entire festival.
Creative New Zealand funding was axed for a Shakespeare competition.
Creative New Zealand's decision to pull its funding from a popular secondary school Shakespeare festival is becoming a bit of a Shakespearean tragedy in its own right.
Which I think would have been quite a big deal and would have been sort of perhaps not worthy of some of the rhetoric that has eventuated, but certainly, I would have wanted to make a fuss about it. But that wasn't, in fact, what was being proposed. What was being proposed was decreasing the funding by this percentage. Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand have since started a Give a Little crowdfunding page, which is pulling in donations from kind of alumni and supporters. They will make up that shortfall. Actually, since I started prepping for this interview, the Prime Minister has even stepped in and said, actually the Ministry of Education can step up and cover that shortfall. So, they've had no trouble dealing to that unfunding, but the conversation around it has been blown completely out of proportion. There's been quite a lot of misreporting, as I say, in terms of, implying that the entire festival was being cancelled. And people have kind of jumped up and down for the past few days saying, we're cancelling Shakespeare in New Zealand. And that's not what's happening. Shakespeare's not going away anytime soon. He's a cultural juggernaut. He doesn't need public funding, as Sam Brooks kind of eloquently wrote on the spin-off. But yeah, a lot of people have got very hot under the collar about it.
That's a point it pays to emphasise. To the best of our knowledge, the future of the Sheilah Winn Festival was never actually under threat. Dawn Sanders, the legendary boss of the organisation that applied for the funding, Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand, said,
I asked for 110,000 because I wanted succession planning. I want proper EA so I don't have to work the insane number of 65 hours a week that I do at the moment or more. And so to share that workload with part of the whole application as well. So the 31,000 that we had last 3 years was only a part of the whole amount needed.
To be clear, this is a fair enough thing for Dawn to want. And we should say, her work is highly respected by many in the theatre community in Aotearoa. But this funding was not specifically to put on the Sheilah Winn Festival. Yet many, including many media organisations, as we just heard, were happy to overlook that. Why? Well, it might have something to do with the reasoning given by Creative New Zealand for turning down the funding application.
In releasing that decision, Creative New Zealand has said things like Shakespeare basically is a canon of imperialistic work that doesn't reflect New Zealand well, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah.
Creative New Zealand ruled the Bard as, quote, located within a canon of imperialism and simply isn't relevant for decolonising Aotearoa.
When you apply to Creative NZ for funding, you have to submit, an application. CNZ then contracts external assessors, experts, who assess those applications and they provide guidance and recommendations to Creative NZ. Following a panel discussion about the merits of the different applications, CNZ then makes a call on what projects receive what funding. When the Shakespeare Globe Centre's application was denied, a handful of quotes from one assessor justifying that decision to cut the funding made their way into the media.
These comments have definitely been cherry-picked, as far as I can tell from the longer reports that the assessors of the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand's funding application would have written. That's worth bearing in mind. We don't know the full context in which they were made. So these peer assessors, the quotations that have been picked out and kind of thrown around in the media, that Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand's application, and it's worth bearing in mind again that this is the application that's being assessed. It's not kind of the sum total of the work that they've done over the past 30 years. It's how they've represented the effects and the benefits of that work in the application that they've made. So it did not demonstrate the relevance to the contemporary art context of Aotearoa in this time and place and landscape, and went on to say that Shakespeare is located within a canon of imperialism, and the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand misses the opportunity to create a living curriculum and show relevance. And they further questioned whether Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand is most relevant for a decolonising Aotearoa in the 2020s and beyond. And so I think there are some interesting things within those comments that have contributed to what people have had their noses put out of joint by.
What on earth are you doing? What on earth are you doing seeking advice on a project like this from someone who is so delusional as to look at Shakespeare in a context of colonialism?
I feel like that's the whole point of why we perform Shakespeare, to modernise it and customise our performance to fit our own themes and ideas into them, not these ones of colonial and imperialistic demeanour.
The thing that interests me, actually, we'll come to the canon of imperialism and the decolonisation in a minute, but the thing that interests me the most is this insistence on relevance. I think we've bought into this cult of relevance across a variety of different arenas. Certainly, university and high school curriculums are often choosing texts based on their relevance. The question is always relevant to whom, and who decides what is relevant. And And, the question that doesn't get asked often is, well, does something have to be relevant to be important? Is relevance the same as importance? Something might not be relevant to us here in Aotearoa in 2022, but it could still be really important. And so that's kind of one thing, that insistence on relevance within those quotations that were picked out. But then I think the thing that has stoked some somewhat unsightly fires, these references to Shakespeare being located within a canon of imperialism and also not being relevant to a decolonising Aotearoa. I mean, Shakespeare certainly has been, I'm a Shakespeare scholar. I actually work on the history of how people have received Shakespeare over the past 4 centuries, and that reception history is really interesting. I mean, this idea of Shakespeare as the Bard of Avon, England's national poet, things like, that wasn't something that existed in Shakespeare's lifetime, for instance. It was posthumously constructed in a variety of ways, some of which we might consider to be sort of insidious, and some of which do kind of intersect with the colonial project a bit later on. So certainly in the past, I think that idea that Shakespeare is located within a canon of imperialism actually isn't that far from the mark, but I would question to what extent that holds true today. I would say that actually Shakespeare's sort of broken free from his kind of colonial tethers and has just become this global brand. Shakespeare is being performed across the world every day in countries that were former colonisers, were formerly colonised, had nothing to do with a colonial project, being performed in a variety of different languages by a variety of different cultures. I wondered whether some of the people who got a bit anxious about the use of this language and the idea of cancelling Shakespeare were actually worried about us here in Aotearoa no longer being part of that global performance tradition, rather than kind of thinking about those direct sort of colonial links between England and Aotearoa. And then, to come to that idea of decolonisation, I think this is a word and a term that people still feel kind of uncomfortable about. They don't quite know what it means in practice. I'm not sure that when it comes to the arts industry that we've really had a sort of wide-ranging collective discussion about what it means and what it could mean in terms of Creative New Zealand's remit to fund art made here. I think if you were to kind of step back and think broadly about their remit, you might say, well, yes, I think this is in keeping with a decolonising project, but actually that term and its cognates don't appear anywhere within the organisation's kind of vision and values documents available on their website. So I think there's a lack of understanding, or just even a lack of consensus about what that term means and whether there is a space for Shakespeare within a decolonising Aotearoa or not. And I think that possibly people didn't agree with the assessors kind of offering an opinion about that.
It is very easy to get sort of, misty-eyed and abstract when people talk about Shakespeare and themes of universality and truisms about the human condition and so on and so forth. But Sean Plunkett did an interesting interview with Stephen Wainwright from Creative NZ a couple of days ago. And he made an observation, Sean Plunkett, that I thought was interesting. He said,
I think Shakespeare's more than an English playwright. I think like Picasso or Beethoven. I think that his art and his contribution to drama and the idea of dramatic storytelling is universal. I think he transcends Englishness utterly and completely. I'd say Shakespeare transcends the petty nationalistic boundaries in the history of New Zealand in many, many ways.
Without wishing to get too romantic about it, he does have a point there, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I am always very frustrated by arguments for Shakespeare's universality and the ability to speak across borders and things like that, because part of what interests me as a Shakespeare academic is, in fact, kind of the particularities of historical difference within the plays and, what's kind of weird and wonderful and foreign about them. But it's quite clear that theatre makers the world over find something in Shakespeare's plays that speak to them within their cultures.
A theatre group in South Auckland is using classic English literature to break down negative stereotypes surrounding Māori and Pacifica people.
Their version of Macbeth is set in an imagined Hawaii with themes drawn from all Polynesian cultures using dance, costumes and music.
I'm currently writing a new introduction for Romeo and Juliet, and that's a play that has a really strong performance history in all sorts of locations where there are cultural clashes. The Montagues and the Capulets within that play are often cast within a particular production as families that belong to the two opposing cultures that inhabit a particular geographical space. There was a very famous Romeo and Juliet in Baghdad about 10 years ago in which they were respectively Sunni and Shia families.
This is not a romantic text. This is very tragic text. I said we was very bad people. We have very bad problem when the conflict beginning between Al-Sunnah and Al-Shia.
You see productions of Romeo and Juliet in Israel and Palestinian families. Those global themes do get translated into the local quite happily. And to be fair, that's the sort of thing that does happen within the Sheilah Winn festival as well, as you see groups of young kids kind of finding the resonances to their own cultural milieus and backgrounds and putting their own takes on this body of work that I think more than anything else, with all of the stuff that it's also been freighted with along the way, one thing that has happened is that it's kind of metamorphosed into this thing where you can stamp your own take on it. Shakespeare, more than any other playwright, kind of licenses you to interpret him in the way that you want to. And I think that's kind of a magical thing, actually.
One of the things that this big backlash kind of reminded me of was the RNZ concert fiasco. It struck me that maybe there is a thing that's going on here, which is this fear from some people that in the artistic sphere there is too much change and that New Zealand work is being put on a pedestal, and that oxygen is coming at the expense of what these people might perceive to be great cornerstones of Western art. That things like Shakespeare and Beethoven and stuff are being written off as white man colonialist art and are therefore by definition bad or irrelevant.
I don't think there's any merit to it. I certainly think it's kind of out there in the ether. I think the nuance that needs to be applied is, what type of art are we talking about meriting public funding? Because, Shakespeare's going to keep on going. You look at the example of the pop-up Globe, which was very financially successful up until COVID just scuppered all live theatre and didn't, as far as I know, receive any public funding. And so, those dead white men don't necessarily need that public funding. And I wish that we could introduce that kind of nuance into it. I mean, and if you're going to say that they do, that's when it sort of starts to become racist dog whistling. Possibly is when you start to say, oh no, they are just as deserving of that kind of funding as people who just kind of wouldn't get a leg up in those industries otherwise. And really it just comes down to the fact that we don't fund the arts well enough in this country. And CNZ's kind of overall pot of funding that it's had to play around with has reduced this year. This is partly why cuts are being made, and people are missing out in both the Kahikatea funding round and other arts funding rounds. I mean, what we really need to have is I wish we weren't having a conversation about who's best, which playwright's best. I wish we were having a conversation about what do we value in terms of an artistic ecosystem. How do we value not just art as a kind of nebulous thing, but the people who make that art? It's artists who have to be able to have enough money in their pockets to pay for their escalating rents and to put dinner on the table. And I think that's the conversation I would have liked to see us having over the past week or so, is a conversation about the amount that we levy in taxes in this country, for instance, which is what kind of, alongside the lotteries funding, which is problematic in a different way. But, you want to publicly fund something, you've got to get the revenue from somewhere, normally taxation. We don't have a wealth tax, we don't have a capital gains tax, we don't have an inheritance tax. There are just so many wider and more nuanced issues that kind of are lying beneath the surface of, oh goodness, we can't possibly cancel the quote-unquote greatest poet in the English language, which was never the debate that should have happened in the first place.
The news came in that the saga has now been brought to, from the Shakespeare Globe Centre's point of view, a happy ending. The government's going to come to the party and it's going to, top up that $30,000 that they...
I just want to say, Emil, that I think that sets a really bad precedent, by the way. I think the idea that public outcry based on misinformation could cause the Prime Minister to step in and kind of offer extra funding when someone's been unsuccessful in a contestable funding bid. I don't know. Do we really want to be doing that?
Looking to the sort of mid to long term, what do you hope comes from all of this?
I guess I hope two things. I mean, I hope that some of the journalism that sort of fed the misinformation that kind of led to everybody getting up on their high horse about the so-called cancellation of Shakespeare, I hope that there's some reflection in terms of the inaccuracies of that reporting and kind of what it led to and the dangers of that. That's one thing I'd like to see. I'd also like to see a wider conversation about what we might mean by decolonising the arts and what that looks like, and a conversation that includes people that perhaps feel anxious about that term or not as kind of clued up on some of the theory around it, and so that we could think about what the place of Shakespeare and other writers was going forward, is this something that is going to recur, this kind of conversation? Should it recur? I hope not in quite this way. Can we come to some sort of clearer understanding of what type of arts industry and arts ecosystem we're hoping to have, and the place of English writers within it, that doesn't involve everybody just sort of chucking their reckons on this bonfire that has been burning so brightly for the past few days. That's what I'd like to see.
On Tuesday, Creative NZ issued a statement on this whole saga. It pointed out that it has limited budget and has to make tough decisions. And when push came to shove, the Shakespeare Globe Centre's application just wasn't as strong as some others. The statement also says, Creative New Zealand does not hate Shakespeare. We support Shakespeare productions and we support Shakespeare being in schools. We simply can't meet the demand for our funding, and hard decisions need to be made. So, there we are. As you like it. That's it for today. I'm Emil Donovan. The Detail is public interest journalism funded through New Zealand On Air and produced by Newsroom for RNZ. You can get us downloaded free to your mobile device every weekday from any podcast platform. Today's episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Sarah Robson, and thanks to Dr. Hannah August. Mā te wā.